Hi, welcome to this video, where we look at securing an MVC application using Enforcer. My name is Kevin Jones from Rock Solid Knowledge. So in this walkthrough, we'll add Enforcer into an MVC application. And once we've installed Enforcer, we'll look at how we add authorization to that application. And we'll do this by writing policies in Alpha. We'll extend the policy information point, the PIP, to provide additional information for the authorization. We'll look at authorization contexts, and we'll see how we can add advice to this policy. So before we get into code, let's take a look at how we set up the IDE to do this. So Rock Solid Knowledge have created a Git repository that we can use as a tutorial. So before we start coding, we need to get hold of the repository. And we can do that by calling git clone on this repository here. So if I hit enter, it clones the repository into samples.enforcer. And if I change into that directory and look inside here, we have a couple of subdirectories. And the one that we care about is the MVC Enforcer tutorial subdirectory. So if I change into that, in here we have a before directory, that's where we'll be working, and then various after directories. And these after directories are solutions at each step of this tutorial. So what I'm going to do is to go to Visual Studio and open up the project inside that before directory. So here I'll do a file open the project, and I cloned it into the temp directory. So we have temp, samples enforcer, MVC enforcer tutorial, before, and there's the CS proj file. So let me open that up. Okay, so once we have that, we can build the project and then we can run it. And this opens into the browser. And this gives us a simple purchasing application. We have some accounts set up here. We have one, for example, called Alice and one called Bob. We can log in using those accounts. So if I log in as Alice here, and her password is Alice, once I've logged in, I can go to the purchase orders section. I can create some purchase orders. So I'd like to buy some golf clubs, say, add an amount, and we can add the purchase order. And we can add another one, let's say a laptop, and again, the amount. And I can also edit these. So let's say I'd like a slightly more expensive laptop and go on update. So you can see Alice can add and edit purchase orders. So if I log out here and then log in as Bob, and his password is Bob, and again go to purchase orders, Bob would like a new phone. So Bob can add purchase orders, but notice that Bob can also edit purchase orders that Alice entered. So each user has the rights to create purchase orders and to edit purchase orders, but they can edit other people's purchase orders as well. So if I go back into Visual Studio and look at the purchase orders controller, we can see that this has the authorize attribute on it. So sure enough, you have to be logged in before you can access this controller, but that's all it does. There are no other rules built into this around who's allowed to access purchase orders and what rights they have on those purchase orders. And that's what we'll fix. We'll write a policy to only allow certain users certain rights with regards to purchase orders. So one of the things we'll do here is write a policy in Alpha. And one of the things that Rock Solid Knowledge provides is a plugin to Visual Studio to let us edit Alpha policies much more easily. So to get that plugin, if I go to the extensions window and do manage extensions and search for Alpha and download this and then restart Visual Studio, the Alpha plugin is being installed. So I click on modify. So the extension's been installed. So I can close the window and restart Visual Studio. Now if I go to extensions and manage extensions and look at the installed extensions, then sure enough, the Alpha extension is there. So we have to do one more thing. We need a license key for Enforcer. So if I go to this URL, so identityserver.com/products/enforcer, from here, you can request a license key. So if I enter my name and my email address and click on Get Demo, then that license key will be emailed to me. So once you have the key, if you go back into Visual Studio and open up the startup.cs file, and then in here, you'll find two values. So for me, I have a demo key, and the licensee is demo. I can paste in my key value. And this demo key lasts for a month. So once we have that, we can now start the rest of this tutorial. Okay, so here we are inside Visual Studio, and there's a few things we need to do before we can start writing code. We're going to create some policies, and those policies will be held in files with a .alpha extension, so we need somewhere to store those files. So if I go into Solution Explorer and right-click and add a new directory here, and we'll call that directory policies. So once we have this directory in place, we need to add the NuGet package that we're going to use for Enforcer. So in the Package Manager console, we do install package, and the name of the package is rsk.enforcer.aspnet-core. So with that installed, inside Configure Services, I can now configure Enforcer. We do this by adding it to the Services collection and calling add Enforcer. And add Enforcer itself takes two parameters. The first is the name of our root policy. We haven't added this policy yet, and we'll do that in a moment. And we'll give this the name acmecorp.global. And the second parameter here are the options that we're going to pass to Enforcer. And in particular in here, we want to set the license and the license key. And these are the values that you would have obtained from rock solid knowledge. So as well as this, we can further configure Enforcer. So for example, we need to tell it where to load the policy files from. And we just created that directory called policies. So we call add file system policy store and give it the directory name. We can also add something called the PEP, the policy enforcement point. And again, we need to configure this. And in here, we're going to add some options. And we're going to set the bias. And basically what we're saying here is that if we get back an indeterminate result from policy, then we should deny access. And this is probably the safest thing to do. We can also bias this to a permit access, but deny is probably best in this case. Another extension we can add here is something called the claims attribute value provider. To this one, we're going to pass some empty options. What this lets us do is use user identity claims when deciding the policy. And then finally here, we'll add some default advice handling. And what this will do is log any advice that is published and return a 403 if we get a deny outcome from policy. Okay, so that's the initial setup done. So what we'll do in this walkthrough is we're going to set up policy around purchase orders. We have some users configured here. Notice there's Alice, Bob, Sally, and Charlie. Some of them are managers. So for example, Alice is a manager. Some of them are employees. Some of them are contractors. And they have different departments. So Alice, Bob, and Charlie are in engineering, and Sally is in finance. And each of these, depending on their role, so depending on whether they're a manager or an employee, and depending on their department, will have different limits and different abilities when it comes to purchase orders. So some of them will be able to create purchase orders, some of them will be able to edit purchase orders. And what we also want to do is to make sure that we can only edit a purchase order if somebody from the same department created it. And we'll do all of that using policy. So the initial way we'll do this is by using attributes on our controller. So we've seen currently the controller has an authorize attribute, and Enforcer provides some extra attributes that we can add into here. And we can use those attributes to guard access to the various methods on this controller. So the attribute we're going to add is called Enforcer authorization. And we need to tell this which resource we're protecting. That's resource in policy terms. So we see resource type equals, and we'll give it this a name. And the resources we are protecting are purchase orders. And we'll define this resource in our policy files in a moment. So if I run this now and log in as Alice, say, notice it's giving us details about Alice's claims. So she's a manager and she's an employee and she's in engineering. If we go to purchase orders for Alice, we get an exception. And the exception we get is that we can't find this policy. So it's looking for a policy called acmecorp.global. And if you remember, that was the root policy name that we set when we called add Enforcer. So what we now need to do is to create that policy. So we do that in our policies directory. So in here, if I do add new item, I want to add a text file, and I'm going to call this global.alpha. So these alpha file extensions are supported by the Enforcer plugin for Visual Studio and for VS Code. So in here, I'm going to define the global policy. And that will look like this. So we define the namespace of Acme Corp. The policy set is global, so that's acmecorp.global. And we're saying to apply the first applicable rule here. So if I save this, go back to Chrome and refresh. So now we're getting denied access to this resource. So the application is loading the policy, it's checking the policy is undetermined, our bias is to deny, therefore we get denied access. So let's go add some rules to this. So the different users have different access to these purchase orders. So we can keep different parts of our policies in different files. So in here, we'll create a file called finance.alpha, and this is where we create our purchase orders policy. So here we're saying permit unless deny. So by default, we're permitting access, and we're specifying our resource type. And the resource type is purchase order. Now back in the global alpha file, we want to import that policy so that it gets used. So in here, I first want to import the namespace. And once I have that, I can specify the policy from that namespace. So again, remember the acmecorp.finance is defined in finance.alpha, and the purchase orders policy is the policy that's created inside finance.alpha. Okay, so let me rebuild the application and rerun it. And now if I refresh, we now have access to purchase orders. So remember, we have permit unless deny here. So by default, everybody gets access. Okay, so let's go add our first rule. And the rule we want to add is that purchase orders are only available to employees. And if you remember, Charlie is a contractor, so this should deny Charlie access. So inside my purchase order policy, we'll have a rule called restrict to employees. And in this rule, we'll specify that we want to deny if the subject role is not an employee. So again, let me rebuild this. Go back to Chrome. So if I refresh, I'm still logged in as Alice, and Alice still has access to purchase orders. If I log out and log in as Charlie, remember that Charlie is a contractor, and try and access purchase orders, then we get denied. So Charlie is denied access. Charlie is not an employee. So we also want to restrict access so that initially only managers are able to create purchase orders. And again, to do that, we can add another rule. So this time, the rule we add is called restrict creation. This only applies to a specific action, which is the create action. And now we deny unless the subject is a manager. So now that we've added this rule, we need to specify where this rule is applied. We need to specify it's only applied when the action is create. And to do that, we add another attribute. So back inside the purchase orders controller, on the create purchase order method, we add another enforcer authorization attribute. For this one, we specify the resource type again, which is still purchase order. And then we specify the action. And the action in this case is going to be create. So we're saying here, look inside the policy and apply any rule for that create action. So if I rebuild this, and again, if I go back to Chrome, if I log in as Alice, remember that Alice is a manager. If I go to purchase orders, from here we can create a purchase order. So Alice wants to buy some golf clubs. Let's say they cost €1,000, pounds, dollars. Click on add. Sure enough, Alice can create that purchase order. If I log out, so if I log in as Bob, now remember Bob is an employee, not a manager. So he still has access to purchase orders, and sure enough, you can see Alice's purchase order there. So Bob would like a new phone. So I type in phone with an amount of say 200 and click on add. This now fails. So we're applying the rule on the create action, and we're saying only managers can execute that action. So only managers in this case can create purchase orders. So that's the initial rules setup. So at the moment, we've just been using identity claims. So what we're going to do now is to change one of the rules. So we're going to change the restrict creation rule so that we allow creation if you're a manager, but we can also allow creation if you're an employee and the purchase order total is less than 100. So the value of the purchase order total has to come from somewhere. And in this case, we're going to get that value from the incoming request itself. So as well as getting values from the claims, we are now going to get values from the incoming request that we can compare against policy. So to do that, inside my policy file for finance, I'm going to add an attribute. And this attribute has a type of double. This is going to be the value. It has an ID, which is purchase order total, and it has a category. And that category is one of the Oasis categories. It's ActionCat. So once we have this purchase order total attribute, we can use this inside our rules. So we can change the restrict creation rule, so to deny if the subject's not a manager, and also to deny if the subject is an employee and the purchase order total is 100 or greater. So that's the policy defined. So we now need a mechanism to map this incoming value from the request, this purchase order total, onto this attribute. So back in the controller, when we create purchase orders, the request comes in from the website in this purchase order request type. And if I go to this type, we can use attribute binding to bind the value from this request to the attribute needed for the policy. And we can do that by adding this policy attribute value attribute to the amount within this request. And we specify some values to this. The first thing we specify is the category. So this category is action, and that maps the category in the attribute defined inside the policy. The second thing we specify is the name of the attribute that we bind to. Again, matching the name inside the policy of purchase order total. And then we add something called the sensitivity. And the sensitivity specifies whether this is a sensitive value or not. So for example, is it personally identifiable information? So if something is marked as sensitive, then for example, it won't appear in any logging. So with all of that in place, if I rebuild the application and rerun this, if I sign in as Alice, Alice still has access to purchase orders and can still create purchase orders. If I log out and sign in as Bob, Bob has access to purchase orders. Now, if I try and create a purchase order for, say, some pencils with an amount that's less than 100, sure enough, Bob can create that purchase order. However, if we try and create a purchase order for, say, a phone for an amount more than 100, then that fails. So we're now basing our decisions both on claims that are coming from the user when they're logged in and from data that's being passed as part of the request. So up until now, we've based all of our decisions around information in the request. So either things like the user's claims, which comes from when the user logs in, or the amount the user is trying to access. So for example, allowing or denying the creation of a purchase order based on a value sent in when the employee tries to create that purchase order. We can also base decisions based on other information. We might base the decision based on things like time of day. So for example, you might only allow access to certain areas during work hours. We can also do things like setting limits depending on the department. So for example, for a finance department, we can set one upper limit, and for the engineering department, set a different upper limit on a purchase order. And to do that, we use something called a policy information point, or a PIP. So the PIP provides extra information to the policy that the policy can then use. So for this example, we are going to add an attribute into the policy, and that attribute is the maximum purchase order value. And that value will change depending on department. To provide a value for that attribute, we're going to extend the PIP, and we'll extend it with something called a record attribute value provider. So the first thing to do is if we go into the finance.alpha and add another attribute. And this time the attribute is the purchase order limit. Again, the type is double. Notice this time it's a resource category, and it has an ID, and that ID is max purchase order value. Now, previously, when we created our attribute, we mapped that attribute onto a value inside an already existing class called purchase order request. For this attribute, we don't have an existing class, so we need to create a new one. So to do this, inside the application, I'm going to add a new directory, and we'll call this policy information points. And inside here, we'll add a new class, and this class we'll call finance department limits. And in this class, we'll define the attribute that will hold this limit. So inside the class, we'll have a variable called max purchase order, and then we need to map this onto the attribute used by the policy. And we've already seen how to do this. So we add the policy attribute value. In this case, the policy attribute category is a resource, and the name of the attribute is max purchase order value. And remember that comes from the alpha. So once we have that, we need to write the class that's going to extend the policy information point. And this class will be an attribute provider. So again, in this directory, we'll add a new class. and we'll call this Finance Department Attribute Provider. This class will extend Record Attribute Provider, and the generic type here will be the type of attribute that we're providing, and that's Finance Department Limits. To implement the missing members here, and we need to implement this getRecordValue method. So this attribute provider operates on different departments. Remember, we're going to use the department to decide what the spending limit is. This method needs to know the department to operate on, and we can use the attribute resolver passed into this method to get that department. And we do that by calling attribute resolver.resolve. And we tell it which type to resolve. We are resolving the name of the department, so this will be a string. And we have to tell it how to resolve this attribute. So to do that, we need to create something of type policy attribute. And that policy attribute looks something like this. So we give it a name of department, the type of the attribute, and that's a string. This is the type that we'll be resolving. And we say that we can get this value from the subject. So here the attribute resolver takes this policy attribute. So it takes a reference to this thing that we called department. This is an async function. So we need to call await on it. And of course we mark this method with the async keyword. So we could get back a collection of values. So we want to say something like this. So once we have the department, we can write the logic to work out the finance limit. There'll only be one entry in this collection. So we call single to get that entry, and then set the purchase order limit to be either 0 if it's not one of engineering or finance, 500 if it's engineering, and 2000 if it's finance. And then finally from this, we need to return an instance of our finance department limits attribute, where in here we just set the max purchase order value to be the limit that we've just calculated. So how do we use this value? Well, we set it back inside startup. So where we call add enforcer here, we can also add a policy attribute provider. And to this, we specify the type of the attribute provider, and that's the finance department attribute provider. So once we have that, we need to update our finance alpha. So currently in here, any manager can create any purchase order. Now what we want to say is that if you're a manager, you can only create purchase orders that match your limit. So the rule becomes this. If you're a manager, then your purchase order total must be less than the purchase order limit. And again, remember that the purchase order limit is the attribute that we specify inside the alpha. So again, if I build this and run it again, if I log in as Bob, remember that Bob is an employee. He's not a manager. So if I try and create something over Bob's limit, which was 100, that will fail, but less than 100 will succeed. If I log out and log in as Alice, Alice is a manager, but in the engineering department. So her limit was 500. So if she tries to order some engineering pencils at 500, that's going to fail. But at 499, that's going to succeed. And finally, if I log out and log back in as Sally, notice that Sally is in the finance department and Sally's limit is 2,000. If she tries to buy golf clubs that cost 2,000, that's going to fail. But at 1999, that succeeds. So you've now limited the ability based on the department that somebody's in. And we've set different limits for each of those departments. So what we have is pretty good. We've limited the creation of purchase orders to employees only. And then we've further limited that creation depending on the department and the role those employees have. And we're basing these decisions on information that's in the current authorization context. What we'd like to do now is to restrict editing of these purchase orders. And we'd like to restrict the editing based on the person's department. So you can only edit purchase orders if they were created by somebody in the same department as you. But to do that, we also need to know which department this purchase order belongs to. And currently we don't have that information. So we need to extend the processing to get that information. And the way we're going to do this is to execute the policy enforcement point directly from inside our controller, rather than just letting Enforcer execute that PEP for us. And to do that, we need to inject the policy enforcement point into the controller so the controller can use it. So let's do that first. So back in the purchase orders controller, to get access to the policy enforcement point, we can add a variable to our constructor. We can add a member to our controller, and then we can initialize this member. So remember, what we're going to do here is to change the policy around editing these purchase orders. So we need to do that inside the edit methods. So let's tackle the get method first of all. So inside here, we're going to take the PEP and we're going to call its evaluate method. And then depending on the result of that evaluation, we'll decide whether we can edit this purchase order or not. Now this evaluate method takes a reference to the authorization context. So we're going to pass that into here, but we need to get this context from somewhere. This context is of type iAttributeValueProvider, and we're just going to set this to null for now, and we'll come back and fix that in a moment. So the result of this evaluation is not permit. We want to fail this call. And to create this failure, we'll add a helper method called authorizationFailed. And this helper method will just return an action result, and that action result will tell ASP.NET what to do. So authorizationFailed looks like this. Create a new view called NotAuthorized. We pass to that view a message. We set the status code to be forbidden, and we return that view. If authorization succeeds, then we just return the view of the purchase orders. Okay, so to write this code, we need access to the department that's associated with the purchase order. And to do that, we need to add another attribute. So I'm going to create a new alpha file here, and we'll call this subject.alpha. And the reason we're doing this is that Oasis comes with a bunch of predefined claims, and we can think of the department as being another claim. And those claims exist in this subject namespace. So we can extend that namespace. In here, we're going to add something into the subject namespace. And as I said, we're going to add another attribute. So the attribute is called department. And like the other attributes we've added, it has an ID, department. The category is subject, and it's a string. So this is the department that's associated with our user, with our subject. We also need a department attribute for the department associated with the purchase order. So let's add that one inside finance.alpha. So that one looks like this. In this case, we've called it purchase order department. Again, it's a resource. And again, it's of type string. Now that we have these two, we can add a new rule called restrict edit. And that rule looks like this. So now we're saying about a rule where the action is edit. And we can only edit if we're a manager and the purchase order department matches the subject department, i.e. the user can only edit purchase orders that came from someone in the same department that they are part of. Okay, so we're not quite there yet. We have the rule set up, but remember back in our purchase order controller, currently we're passing null for this context. So we need to create a context here to pass into this evaluate call. And inside that context, we need to be able to specify both departments, the one coming from the subject and the one coming from the purchase order itself, to get mapped into the policy so the policy can then check those departments. So to do that, we're going to create our own authorization context. So inside models, I'm going to add a class, and we'll call this class edit purchase order authorization context. And this class derives from authorization context. This has a constructor that takes the action that we want to provide context for, and then tells the base class the resource type we provide the action for, which is our purchase order, and the action. And here we define two mappings, one for the purchase order department that's coming from the purchase order itself, and one from the purchase order total. So once we have that, back in the controller, rather than passing null for the context here, we can now create the edit purchase order authorization context. We pass it the action, which is edit, and we set the value of the department ourselves. And this will then be mapped into the policy. Okay, let me build this and rerun it. So if I log in as Alice, so Alice is in engineering. We create a purchase order for pencils, let's say. Alice can edit that purchase order. If we log out and log in as Sally, Sally's in finance. If we go to purchase orders, Sally's not allowed to edit that purchase order. And we get a message from the view that we specified to say you're not authorized to edit this PO. So we've protected the HTTP GET here, which is the initial edit of the purchase order. What about the HTTP POST, which is the update to the purchase order? So the code for this is very similar. So inside the POST, we need to create the context. But notice now, the action we're passing is update rather than edit. And then after that, the code's the same. So we evaluate the context. If the outcome's not permit, then we return an authorization failed view. We also need to edit the rules, both for create and for edit. So in finance.alpha, we're currently checking for an action of create and an action of edit on both restrict creation and restrict edit. So for both of these, we can say or action equals update. So now we're only allowing edit or update for employees within the same department. So we have one last thing to do, and that's to add some advice to the policy. And we'll do this in 2 steps. We'll first add some specific advice, so a specific authorization failure message, and then we'll add a catch-all piece of advice. So for any failure that we aren't catching specifically. So to do this, the first thing we need to do is to specify the advice inside the policy. So in my policies folder, we'll add a new file called advice.alpha, and we define the advice by specifying an attribute. So in here, the first thing we do is add a namespace called acmecorp.advice. The advice will live in a category, so we define that first of all, and then we create the attribute. And the attribute will look like this. So it has an ID, so it's authorization failure message, the category that we defined above, and the type, which in this case is just a string. And then finally, we define the advice, and the advice is called authorization failure. So to use this in our finance.alpha, we need to first import this advice, and then we need to use it. And we're going to use this inside edit. So when somebody's denied permission to edit the purchase order, we'll issue the advice. So inside restrict edit, we say on deny to specify that something happens when permission is denied. Inside here, we say advice to say that we're going to issue some advice. And the advice we're going to issue is the advice we just created. So the authorization failure. And then inside here, we can specify the message. And for that, we'll say something like this. So authorized failure message is managers can only edit their own department POs. This PO is for, and it's for purchase order department. Now, single is a function that's defined in the Oasis functions namespace. As well as importing oasis.attributes, we can also import oasis.functions. And that resolves the error that we had here. So to use this advice, we need to map the advice from the policy back into the code. So in our models folder, we'll add a class, and we'll call this authorization failure advice. We annotate this with the enforcer advice attribute. We give this class a single property, which is the message that will be passed as part of the advice. And then we annotate that message with the policy attribute, specifying how to bind this message from the policy. So back in the controller, we added this authorization failed message to display a view when some authorization failed. And we can now make use of the advice inside this method. So on the policy evaluation outcome, I can look to see if there's any unresolved advice of this type authorization failure advice. And this will return me a collection of authorization failure advice instances that I can assign to a variable. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the view so that rather than passing in an array of string objects, I'm going to pass in this collection of authorization failure advice objects. So I pass in here failure reason. I then need to update the not authorized view to use this model. So I change the view to look like this. The model becomes a collection of authorization failure advice objects, and then we iterate over those advice objects and just display the message from each piece of advice. So now that's done, we can rebuild the code. I can go back to the browser, and then if I log in as Bob, Bob can create purchase orders, but Bob's not allowed to edit purchase orders. And notice now, we're getting the message coming from the advice. So this advice is now being picked up when we have an authorization failed on edit, but it's not being picked up for any other deny outcome. So we can add a global advice handler to do that. So back in startup.cs, we can further configure enforcer, and we can call add enforcer authorization deny handler and make this of type authorization failure advice. And then to this, we can pass a reference to the view that's going to be used to display this advice. And we can use the same view that we use for the edit advice. So once I've done this, I can add advice to the other rules for policy. So if I go back into my finance.alpha, on restrict creation, we can again add an on deny clause with a message around this advice. In this case, we're using another helper here called toString, and toString comes from the enforcer functions. So I can also import that. So now we have advice around creation. So if I build this and go back to the browser, log in as Alice, go to the purchase orders and try and create a purchase order for more than 500 and do add, then again, we get the advice. In this case, it's very specific. Then managers can raise purchase orders up to $500. So we're seeing here that we are generating the advice in the policy and then mapping that onto output in the application. So that's the end of the code part of this walkthrough. So let's just take a brief look at some of the benefits that Enforcer provides. I think the main thing we can see here is that with Enforcer, we get a clear separation of concerns between policy and code. So in our case, we had policy in files held in a directory, but those files are human readable. So the policy can be checked by somebody that's not a coder. So you can take a policy along to the business can take a look at it, and it's in a format that is understandable by anybody. And this policy is also easily deployable. Again, the example we've seen here is using files, but other mechanisms are available as well. So I hope you've enjoyed this walkthrough. For more information, either email sales@identityserver.com or visit https://www.identityserver.com/product/enforcer for more information. Thank you.